Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're now at the golden time of 3:33 in the afternoon, and ready for the final panel in block 2. So we have 4 speakers in this panel, and I think there has been a shift about. Tell me, Verena, which is the shift about, so I get it right.
Okay, can everyone see the screen okay? Okay, fabulous. Just before I start, I have had a non-COVID related cold this week, so apologies for any coughing. I will try and make this presentation as cough-free as possible. So as Heather says, I am a colleague at Glasgow Caledonian University. I am a lecturer and research fellow there. And today I just want to explore one of my concerns in relation to the intersections of immigration border technology within social work practice. And my journey into this particular area has been shaped by my own PhD research, exploring the impact of immigration bordering practices in the UK. And today I want to focus upon one aspect of this, and that involves the materiality of border technologies. Because I've been trying to understand, what this means for social work and how we actually respond to state bordering projects that are currently shaping how we do a social work practice. Okay, so let's have a look. To begin with, I just briefly want to provide some of my research background. Just to set the context before I dive into examining what I mean by border technologies. So I conducted ethnographic research with the Women's Asylum Seeker Housing Project in Glasgow, and some of my key findings I've highlighted here, and that really involves bordering practices within social work, and that really resonates with what we've seen in the UK in terms of everyday bordering policies in regards to what's now considered the now notorious hostile environment for those who are subject to immigration control. So what we see is an internal bordering regime that's really impacted and shaped how we do social work. And I mean, the main policy here being what's called the no recourse to public funds policy. And basically that's a legal condition that's imposed upon anyone that's subject to immigration control. And what that basically means is that people can't access welfare benefits, social housing and homelessness assistance. But it's important to keep in mind that actually social services is not a public fund, so technically anyone can still access social work support if need be. So in my recent paper, I draw from the work of Achille Membe to essentially argue that this amounts to what he terms necropolitical exception, whereby what we see is categories of eligibility in social work are based on immigration status that's linked to discrimination upon the grounds of race. We have successive immigration acts that have demanded more and more documentation to prove status. And then in turn, we see racialized bodies that have been rendered illegal and unworthy of protection. So we have numerous serious case reviews now in social work that do show the consequences, the devastating consequences of this policy, and have highlighted that social workers have a limited understanding of the lived realities of this policy. Some of my research themes there that came out were notions of illegality, gatekeeping within social work practice, and what I termed a bordering of bed and breakfast accommodation, whereby people were in inappropriate accommodation for long periods of time. But what I want to look at today is a 4th theme, which I've termed Kafkaesque politics of confusion. So what do I mean by a politics of confusion? Well, it's essentially what Woodward terms here as the mobilization of what he terms complex spaces, unknown regulations, and opaque bureaucratic cultures. Now, one example here that I've included is that of immigration removal centres. Now, the image here that I took is from it's Dungavel Immigration Removal Centre, and that's just outside of Glasgow. And I've included a quote here from a research participant as well. And she had actually been in detention, and she stated that they took me to a place, but I don't know what kind of place it was. It's a place where they take people like me. So during this time when I was conducting interviews and I'd been to Dungavel, and it struck me as very Kafkaesque. So for those of you that may have read Kafka, that's exactly what Dungavel reminded me of. It reminded me of a scene from The Castle, and also, you know, the famous Kafka quote where he states that it's painful to be ruled by laws that one does not know. When I spoke to participants in my research, that's what they described. You know, they described this as a very surreal, nightmarish situation of immigration dawn raids, detention centres, all of which seemed to kind of defy rational explanations. And we had laws and rules like the NRPF rule that felt like being in a very Kafkaesque labyrinth, a very faceless institution. So participants described being confronted with a system that was opaque, unjust, and very contradictory, you know, not knowing who to believe, not knowing which information to take literally. And this included social work services as very impenetrable for those that were attempting to access support. And there was also like a huge sense of mistrust towards social workers who were very much being drawn into performing that role of an immigration border guard as well. So what I want to pay attention to is what we see here in the next slide, and that is the materiality of border technologies, because this was a key aspect of the kind of Kafkaesque confusion, and it was part of this bureaucratic maze. So the image that you see here is from a convoy that I was part of to the Calais refugee camp, and that was back in 2015. So during my time there, I was struck by the huge amount of technological border security that was being deployed. And as Mila Vosovic states here, she states that bordering practices that aim to combat illegalized migration, characterized by the erection of border walls and fences and the development of tech-based border security interventions. So what we see is technology that has been at the forefront of governing migration and mobility for several decades. And this is a really important point to keep in mind, because she highlights, you know, we know bordering is happening in policies, but we've not paid enough attention to the materiality of these technologies, the science and technology of this, the things of this. We know we're using more and more biometric data. We're seeing drones being deployed within the Mediterranean, and we're seeing digital technologies that are now both used as surveillance and deterrence tools in relation to migration control. And what I want to look at today and highlight is the intensification of this within UK social work today. So that's what I'm going to focus upon. What I want to look at is one example of this in regards to a database that's being used within the UK. Okay, so it's called NRPF Connect, and this is used in statutory social work within the UK. And as you can see there in the image from the NRPF network, it's basically used to generate automated alerts, conduct audit trails, and to increase messaging between the local authority and the Home Office. We can see here the quote from the NRPF network that it's actually designed to meet the data management and immigration status checking needs of any local authority seeking to improve service delivery for adults, families, and children with no recourse to public funds. Now, it's important to keep in mind that currently we've got 69 councils across the UK that are using the NRPF Connect database. And it's quite often promoted as best practice, you know, something that provides vital communication between the Home Office and the local authorities to ensure effective service delivery. So what I want to do is I just want to walk you through some of the detail just to show you how immigration concerns are now being prioritised and mobilised through this technology. And this is obtained from online local authority user guides and from survey responses from social work. That's all available online. Okay, so what we see here from one of the user guides is the prioritization of immigration status checking. I've highlighted this in red. So it's very upfront in stating that the aim is as an immigration checking device, and that communication with the Home Office is definitely prioritised. to verify the immigration status of a particular person or family that's come into contact with social services. Now, what I want to really emphasize and what's important to keep in mind is from interviews that I conducted with women at the Women's Asylum Seeker Housing Project, this was a real key concern from theirs. They were extremely fearful to approach social services because they were scared that social services would contact the Home Office. And then this in turn created a lot of fear in relation to the possibility of dawn raids or maybe being sent to detention centres. So what this did was it really undermined their trust and their relationship with their social worker. And I think it's something that we really need to keep in mind. So as you go further into the user guide, you can see here some points that I just want to highlight. So if you can see at the top of the image there, you can see how immigration alerts are generated there. Now, what I really want to pay attention to is the language that's used here. So we can see in the immigration status box, we can see overstayer. We see language such as deception, such as breach. You know, this is language that's steeped in notions of criminality. This is very far from anti-oppressive language that should be used in social work practice. And then at the bottom of the image here, we can see a nod to what's called enforcement action. And we see here questions such as, has a removal decision been made? And then a date to return. Now, what this translates to is essentially immigration raids, which is being criticised as a Home Office terror tactic against migrants in the UK. And all it does is spread a fear in migrant communities. And quite often with legal advocacy, you know, people who are subjected to immigration raids have ongoing immigration cases and are already in the immigration system. There's also been widespread criticism of NHS England and the Department of Education, who have been using similar databases, and they have shared patient details and the names and addresses of school pupils with the Home Office, who have then been passed on to immigration enforcement. So it seems that the local authority seems to have escaped this kind of scrutiny, but I think this is definitely an area of concern, especially for social workers who are being drawn into this role of border guards and potentially using technology such as this. So interestingly, Islington Council did some research with social workers here and to see how the database is received in social work practice. And social workers have actually stated that they think that it facilitates a vital link and supports positive communication, as is demonstrated there. As I said before, it's quite often promoted as best practice with little rigor or interrogation as to what this technology actually does in reality. As you go further into the survey results with Islington Council, you can see, you know, what people liked about NRPF Connect, and that was, as I've stated before, the sharing and the communication with the Home Office, the ease of access to information, which includes people's immigration history, and the user-friendly nature of the database. Again, what people disliked about NRPF was that sometimes the responses were inaccurate or insufficient, and then there was maybe issues with login access when working from home. What we don't see here is, you know, issues about data protection, potential violations of privacy. You know, what about further discrimination and increasing surveillance in terms of working with already racialized communities? And also, you know, the consequences here of inaccurate and insufficient responses. I mean, what's going to happen? Does this mean that people are going to be subjected to unnecessary immigration raids? There was a lot here that's going on that we haven't really interrogated. So I actually went on training with the NRPF network when I was doing my research. And I'm not completely critical of the network. They have some excellent resources. They are actually leading the way in terms of providing detail around NRPF. So I'm not completely critical of the network, but I do think we need to interrogate, you know, what is going on with the database, as I do think it raises some really problematic questions. In terms of as I've highlighted in this image here, some of the things that we were encouraged to gather information about when someone would present to social work services would be, gathering details about passports, birth certificates, credit checks, obtaining school and GP information, obtaining bank statements that would then all be inputted into the NRPF Connect database. And I've just included some quotes here from research participants that kind of, I think, really highlight the problematics of this. So for Laura, who had tried to access social services support when she was destitute, and she was in the immigration system, she'd given all her immigration evidence and paperwork to her social worker to then still be denied support and told that she was illegal and that she wasn't able to access support, which left her feeling, extremely fearful and unsure where to turn. She had a small baby at the time and was left destitute. So that was extremely distressing for her. And then as we see Rashad in his quote here, he really emphasizes the Kafkaesque kind of element of this. So he talks about never receiving any confirmation or any proof. Everything's recorded on the database with no communication. So it left him feeling very confused and unsure of where he would turn then. Again, he was destitute and he needed to access social services support. So we see a very Kafkaesque situation here, and the database is definitely a key actor within that space. And I think we really need to think about, what spaces are being created here in social work that risk being complicit with the hostile environment and risk being complicit within immigration bordering projects. Just to conclude, just because I'm aware of time here, the key message from me today is when we talk about border technologies, I think we really need to pay attention to what these technologies are doing in regards to border control and surveillance within social work practice. We really need to attempt to interrogate the technology because it is so entangled into immigration and becoming so more in social work practice that it becomes really difficult to opt out. So for social workers working within this space, how do they say, I'm not going to use this database, I don't want to use this? I think we need to analyze how they might be able to push back against this. I think digital technologies are going to play an even bigger role within border control, and then that will filter into social work, and that will play technology will play more of a role in surveillance and control, and that poses some really pertinent ethical, legal and policy questions around privacy and security. In terms of theory, Latour's notion of black boxing is extremely helpful when talking about the database, because the kind of notion here with black boxing is that technology becomes so successful that you only focus on the input and the output, but you're not working on the internal complexities of the database. So I think using that kind of theoretical lens really helps us to understand and provokes us to really rethink the impact and the consequences of a technological infrastructure like the NRPF Connect database has when working with people that are subject to immigration control. Okay, I think that's about it for me, but I look forward to some of the conversations within the Q&A. I think that's me on time.
Thank you so much, Natalia. That's fantastic, and yeah, really interesting when they're thinking about how do you improve practice when you're working against these systems that are designed to work with a different ethics, shall we say. But thank you so much, that's brilliant. I'll move on quickly because I know we're running slightly behind time now, and I think that Colin is up next. Colin, are you around?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, and you're in the spotlight already, so that's fantastic. So I'm going to pass on to you, Colin. If you can introduce yourself, that would be fantastic. And your focus.
I'll certainly do that. I'm trying to get to the start. Can you see my slideshow?
Yep.
Good.
I can definitely see it. So I'm guessing.
Find the start. Oh no, I've lost it again. Sorry. Um, Sorry, I think I can't find the start of it, so I think I'm just going to have to do it from here. Okay, I'm Colin. Although I'm down as being associated with Glasgow Caledonian University, I better admit that I'm actually not. Stephen gave me an email address and access to the library, which has been really useful for a lot of the work I've been doing, but I actually have a practitioner background. I was involved as a social worker, and for the last 12 years or so as a team manager in local authority in Scotland for nearly 40 years. During that time, I was very active in the trade union, was fortunate enough to get the opportunity to do a master's degree, and through that began to write and commentate on stuff, which I continue to do. And for a while now, I've been involved with the Commonweal think tank group. And Commonweal is an independent supporting left-wing think tank who probably until last year, when the pandemic began to hit, really had very little interest in social care. With the level of deaths in care homes, Commonweal became interested in that, interested in critiquing that, and established a social care reform working group, which I'm now on. So what we tried to do here is we published a report, which I principally authored a few months ago, but it was a collective effort, which was an attempt to try and raise social work's profile in Scotland as an institution with a progressive rather than oppressive potential. I know that resonates with some of the previous discussions we've had this afternoon. So the attempt of this paper is probably wouldn't be very useful if you work in a teaching institution, but it might be useful if you're trying to talk to members of the public who don't have much knowledge about social work, about what we do. So these are quotes from the paper, just saying how many social workers there are in Scotland, about 11,000. I think people will be surprised that that's something like double the number of general practitioner doctors, who also talking about doubling and more than double the salary of social workers. I don't think people would be surprised at that. And then going on to describe in fairly basic terms what social workers do, but also some of the restrictions on what they do and some of the problematic role that we now have come to fill. I wish I could get this on. I don't know why it's not allowing me to, because it did earlier.
I think if you want to start the present, oh yeah, there you go.
Here we are, right. Yeah. So I'll move on to look at the state that social workers in. These are things that will be familiar to you as an audience. These are all things that we are completely ground down and affected by. Cuts, managerialism, the performance-driven priorities, the increasingly narrow role, the fact that particularly as a result of the pandemic, now many social workers are working from home, they're quite isolated. If they are allowed into workplaces, which is beginning to happen again now, they're increasingly subject to hot desking. Social work in Scotland, as it has in other parts of the UK, has been increasingly assimilated by health. And health, of course, has brought medical models of practice into social work. There is a huge public misunderstanding about the role of social work. I've seen research that suggests that public support of social work, and certainly in Scotland, actually isn't that bad, but there's not a lot of understanding about what social workers actually do. We've seen, particularly in England, attacks on social work education, the privatisation of social work education, a process that seems to be now quite well embedded, and that's been a threat to the autonomy of social work education. There are issues to do with safety at work, mostly arising because of the situation social workers find themselves in, rather than that we are confronting a more aggressive population. And of course, it's inevitable that that will result in a high staff turnover. And I was looking at vacancies in Scotland earlier on today, and it's no surprise that the highest number of vacancies are in areas of the country that are where poverty is most endemic. So has social work always been like this? Well, not really. I'm just going to go on and put all those down. I put up a picture there of the 1985 miners' strike in the UK, because that was really a watershed for social work here. Social work at that time was able to take sides, and it very much, certainly in the west of Scotland, sided with the miners. Miners were, Natalia's just been talking about NRPF. Well, now striking workers can't get benefits. If the single miners then couldn't either, and the big local authority in the west of Scotland decided, because it was controlled by a politically sympathetic group of politicians, that they would support single miners and ensure that they didn't starve. For that, they were punished. It wasn't long before local government in Scotland was completely reorganised, so that that kind of situation would never happen again. So social work, going back, has held out the promise of a better society. It has held out the idea that the disadvantaged in society should be more proactively supported, and that social work was not just about protecting the public from themselves. But since the 1990s, that's been very, very much the focus and emphasis. We've introduced a market into social work. We've introduced changes that have reinforced the idea that we're driven by risk assessment, that we're driven by the idea that people can be bad, and that our job is to police them and protect the vulnerable from other vulnerable people. And this, of course, has all been made worse by austerity and cuts in public expenditure. So looking at values, these are things that you'll all be familiar with. Social work, of course, does have incredible potential. It also has the potential to be a very rewarding profession for the people that are in it. But certainly at the moment, it has a very oppressive side. All aspects of statutory social work in Scotland have an oppressive role, and that oppressive role is often encouraged, perhaps not overtly, but nonetheless encouraged. Natalia's been describing the ways in which that's certainly the case in the way social work supports or doesn't support asylum seekers. So the result is that mainstream practice is dull, it's ineffective, it's dominated by procedural risk assessment. And I suppose the trick then is how we can move away from, how quickly we move away from its promise to it being an oppressive, regressive, self-defeating and unrewarding activity, and how we can begin to imagine that the public might demand that it moves back and away from that after something like 20, 25 years of continually consolidation of that kind of practice. So it's unrewarding, it's overwhelming. Practitioners capitulate, they surrender, they leave the profession, they possibly move into academia, or they move into something else entirely because they just can't cope with it anymore. This in Scotland, we had the last major review of social work in 2005, published in 2006. It's got a lot to answer for. It tried to define social work's place in society and was welcomed by most of us because of that, without us really being aware of what we were agreeing to or what we were signing up to or becoming complicit with. And as a consequence, it's been almost forgotten, but not by those of us who trace the ills that are apparent throughout social work at the moment to its findings and directions. And that table there, which I know that it's not very clear, but it suggests a tiered intervention model where social workers are right at the top, basically just dealing with the most complex problems in relation to child protection, adult protection, vulnerable adults, and so on, statutory interventions, in other words. And right down at the bottom, you have prevention, building community capacity, the stuff that certainly all of us who trained prior to somewhere around about 2000 would have put at the very top of our list of things that we should be doing as social workers. And we've moved to a situation where that's regarded as a peripheral activity. So in fact, in most local authorities, social workers are not encouraged to do anything down at that tier 1 intervention level. If anyone is commissioned to do that, it's often third sector organizations who are not accountable publicly to the same extent. They're commissioned on a year by year and very insecure basis often. So the consequence of that have been, I've put a few questions on the side here, that over the last year, one of the things that we recognized in Commonweal when we were looking at this was that social work had really been quite peripheral to the pandemic response. Another care home deaths were a national scandal in Scotland, but an ongoing one, care home deaths through COVID, but an ongoing one that's been around increasingly for a number of years now has been Scotland's catastrophic level of deaths associated with drug misuse. Much, much higher than anywhere else, either in the UK or in Europe. And why are social workers never mentioned in public discussions about that? We've just become so marginalized and peripheral that we've found ourselves out of these discussions. Why are we not more proactive in supporting asylum seekers? The question arising from the last contribution from Natalia. So our task, as we saw it in Commonweal, was to try and look at how we could bring social work back into the mainstream. And so we've published a number of reports, and that work is ongoing. And you can access them quite easily on the internet. And the Struggling to Care one, which was specifically about the role of social workers, is part of that. And our thrust in trying to bring social work back into the mainstream is to look at a model of community social work. It's got a long history in Scotland. Walter Lorenz mentioned that earlier. It's certainly something we were very proud of in the past, but which we seem to have lost entirely. Community social work is all about intervening at an early stage. It's all about models of prevention. It's all about networking within communities, being based within communities. And it should be seen as a mainstream activity. I get quite frustrated when I hear a welcoming for these ideas and a suggestion that somebody else should be asked to do it. That social workers should remain concentrated on that tier 4, tier 5 level of intervention, the statutory intervention, and not do this. Well, quite honestly, colleagues, if you're not doing the preventative stuff, then you will always be overburdened by stuff at that highest level of intervention. So community social work, I've got a model here of quite a crude model of just showing how the potential for it being introduced. There on the left-hand side in that column, you'll see what really characterizes traditional current forms of social work. The next column shows the difference with a community orientated model of social work. And then the final column looks at some of the changes that can be put in place. And there are local authorities in Scotland that are seriously looking at that. I'm on the project board at the moment for an authority in the west of Scotland who are seriously looking at how they can move their adult services back to communities and move out the kind of silos, that specialized silos, far away from communities that social workers are often found in now. So that potential is there. So I'm going to finish with that. I've really flown through it very fast because of time. We are stand foursquare for a national care service that's not just about social care for older people or vulnerable adults. It's a cradle to grave operation that sits alongside the National Care Service, that's run through accountable local authorities, and that within that we think that that we could shift the focus from the individualization of social problems that social workers tend to operate by to a community-based approach. And that requires, should be a bottom-up activity. It should be built from the bottom, but it does require facilitation from good people. So if you're interested in accessing our stuff, that's where you can find it. So the heart of our argument is that it's very hard to find people that disagree with this. Very hard to find them. Everyone I talk to says that community social work is the way forward, but the problem always is, how do we get there? Oh, we can't, we're too burdened at the moment with statutory cases to have the capacity to look elsewhere, rather like the problem that was being described earlier in teaching institutions about how we find the time to bring in these better models and more progressive ideas into teaching. It's the same problem here with how we shift social work back to communities, but it's not impossible. And we've suggested a model that could allow that. So there we go. Thanks very much, folks.
Thank you so much, Colin. It's really fantastic to hear sort of the return to community and to the commons, and your sort of very grounded approach to making that happen, with just some of these ideas with the real world and how we negotiate it. So thank you so much. I'm sure we'll return to those in the Q&A. I'm conscious now that we're a full 15 minutes behind. My colleagues will be able to have any poor chairing of keeping people on, but anyhow, we'll move on to our final presenters of this panel, and that I believe is going to start with Gary. Is that right? No, Neil. We're going to start with Neil.
Yeah, it's myself. Yeah, myself and Gary. That's right.
Okay, so I shall quickly pass on to you, because as I said, I've been a very poor chair, 15 minutes behind, but I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thanks so much. Okay, hopefully this will follow nicely from Colin's presentation. So it's myself and Gary who are taking this, because our colleagues from Brazil and India are unable to join us, unfortunately. So I'll take you through the first part of the presentation, and then I'll hand over to Gary midway through. My name is Neil Gibson. I'm a senior lecturer at Robert Gordon University in Scotland, and I'll let Gary introduce himself when we get to that stage. So we're sort of in the early stages of this project, and we're looking at social work practice following the COVID pandemic, rediscovering the importance of macro intervention. And to do this, we were really trying to take as big a focus as we possibly could, because we recognised that obviously no part of the world has been untouched. These are some of the more recent figures that illustrate the number of confirmed COVID cases, 170 million and growing, with 3.5 million deaths and growing as well. And you can see the vaccine rollout is still in its infancy as well. Problem is, as we all know, the numbers do not tell the whole story. There's an enormous amount of underreporting. There's a difference in how statistics are collected in different countries as well. There's significant differences in the availability of the vaccine, depending where you live in the world, and also differences in the lived experience of everybody who has gone through COVID. So we looked at three perspectives. We looked at the Brazilian perspective, looked at the Indian perspective, and say the UK perspective, but probably more so the Scottish perspective. But we recognise that that's within the context of the UK approach as well. Why we chose these three approaches? Well, availability of colleagues was one of them, but we tried to look at the different socio-economic circumstances of the countries and looking at the differential impacts of the capitalist economic systems as well. But what we found, or what we were trying to look at, was the more macro issues, because we're aware that there's lots of different micro issues, but whether there were similarities in the macro issues that we could learn from as well. Of course, there was challenges in gathering these stories as well. We're looking at different social systems and the strains on these different social systems. So we know that the pandemic has exacerbated these strains. I mean, we can see that in full focus in the UK in particular. Already there was sort of different ways in which society was coping with neoliberal implementation, different government approaches as well. And also we recognize that while we're using the same social work conversations, there was different approaches and understandings of some of the concepts. I mean, flippantly, I suppose, if you look at social distance, if you've got a huge, massive population within a city, take Kibera in Africa, for example, where you've got informal settlements. Social distancing is not that easy. My wife's Finnish, and she jokes that the Finns have been social distancing since the formation of the country because the physical space in the country. So we've got these elements to consider as well. And we have to recognise that the pandemic is in very different phases wherever we are in the country. And it looks like we're going well and truly into a third stage here. What we've also seen is this growing mistrust, almost like quite a divisive conversation. We see suspicion in other cultures because they potentially bring in the virus. We see the ways in which people are compliant and how you're made to feel guilty if you're not compliant, or if you're made to feel guilty if you are compliant, and how then that leads to alienation. And we also recognize that there's multiple borders. It's not just physical country borders. There's the rural versus urban experiences. There's different family experiences. Even in Scotland here, we've got different approaches to different regional approaches to tackling coronavirus as well. So our colleagues in Brazil summarise the situation there. Interestingly, I suppose the access to health, 72.1% of the population do have access to public health system, but that means that roughly about 60 million people don't have that access to public health as well. We're dealing with a vast population, and when we look at the rate or the prevalence of coronavirus and the deaths linked to that, the figures that we've been given, almost 18 million coronavirus cases, but actually quite a small number for deaths, 493, given the large population of Brazil. And the vaccine rollout is obviously still in its infancy there as well. But some of the key challenges are around about the link between the economic crisis and how that's impacted on probably the working class more. There's the government approach in Brazil as well, which has been linked to the word genocide in terms of how the government reacted initially to the coronavirus concerns. There's links to the labour reform and social inequality, like I said, xenophobia, racism as well, and looking at the impact on health professionals in particular, the length of time it takes to be involved in a particular case, the fatigue involved in that as well. And like the UK, the shortage or inadequacy of equipment. India, probably the biggest population in our study, Very different approach to social work delivery in India, we recognise as well. But you can see the rate of COVID-19 cases, 29, almost 30 million. And again, the deaths, smaller than Brazil, 383, 100,000. And the vaccine rate, again, still in its infancy. But very different access to health in India as well. So some of the issues that came out of there were the links to high economic growth, but the formation of much more of a gig economy, so the informal labour market and the impact this has if you've got a population that can't work due to illness. The lack of comprehensive social care, the impact financially and mentally on bereaved families, and then looking at other issues, side issues like orphan children and the risk of trafficking of children as well, and the overburdening of the health system. Then we've got the UK position. Obviously, Scotland are undeveloped government, but the UK situation, as we all know, has not been good at all. 4.6 million coronavirus cases and growing, deaths over almost 130,000. Vaccine dose rollout has actually been pretty successful. And then we've got the Scottish approach in particular. So we're only 8.2 of the UK population. We have a devolved government. And the impact of COVID, 248,000 cases with 10,000 deaths. But interestingly, over a third of the deaths were linked to the population in the over 85 age group category. And I know it's already been acknowledged that there was a significant impact in care homes in the UK, but also in Scotland as well. The highest fatality occurred in densely populated cities such as Glasgow, but there was a fairly even split between the impact on gender. So looking at the challenges for social work, and I know I come at this from a social work educator perspective, but looking at the adoption of new technologies and how that was integrated with the knowledge that we have an aging population and trying to encourage the take up of these new technologies, but also widely looking at the social work delivery is accessing resources due to funding cuts and socioeconomic factors. So families on low incomes or no incomes, they couldn't access the equipment that we were looking at using in social work, in health and education. Certainly a widening divide between social classes, but also, again, as acknowledged, the impact of the media and how social work were represented there. I mean, quite rightly so, NHS were celebrated in what they were doing, but there was other care providers that weren't acknowledged. And even in Hancock's resignation this weekend, he didn't even acknowledge the role of social work or social care, and that's coming from the Health Secretary. So looking at how we then educate students to look at influencing change as they go out into the profession. So I think we're good at the micro level, but maybe we need to be better at looking at the macro level for students. I want to hand over to Gary now, who's going to take you through the what we've learned from the three countries.
Thanks very much, Neil. I've just realized I can't actually move the slides, Neil, so you might need to move them for me. Well, maybe it does. So I'm GarySpolander. I've recently joined RGU, and I'm part of the consortium, and I noticed a couple of my colleagues from Brazil are here, Lucia and Fabiola mainly, and so we'd be happy to pick up questions at the end. As you can imagine, picking up the context across three countries is quite complicated, and there's lots of individual country things we could talk about. But I think clearly there are echoes across all three countries that we need to consider. And many of these kind of trends had commenced before COVID and have perhaps been exacerbated by COVID. And what we see is this growing need for support for mental health, clearly post-COVID, during COVID for children too, the greater sense of social isolation, loss of educational opportunities for children, the opportunities for people to socially engage, I think, as many people have picked up already today, and obtain emotional and family support. And one of the big challenges going forward will also be the impact of long COVID, whose impact we don't quite know as yet. And I think, as Neil outlined, we've had incredibly high death rate and societal impact. And really, in talking about these numbers, what we also need to be mindful is the need to retain our commitment to humanity, and that these are people that are within these numbers that we're talking about, and almost that sense that we can feel the fear, but at the same time we need to remain hopeful of a much better future post-COVID. And we see higher levels and demands for services. There's clearly been an impact on workloads of social workers, intensive home working, the use of technology has already been talked about. And with that, within social workers has been higher stress levels through caseloads, emotional and technical challenges, rapid changes to working patterns and engagement, the loss of informal support and immediate support from colleagues and from managers, blurred boundaries increasingly between work and home, the kind of sense that I now live at work rather than anything else, and growing discontent with social workers of social policy change and process, and the personal impact of practicing for months under pandemic conditions in terms of social workers' own mental health, burnout, isolation, post-traumatic stress, etc. And those kind of the impact of changed working conditions, including things like the lack of time spent traveling to work, results in a feeling that we're always expected to be available for the next phone call or the next Skype conversation or video meeting. And that the nature of social work itself has changed to become much more administrative rather than relationship-based, with increased bureaucracy due to perhaps some of the things like risk-assessed visits, PPE requirements, etc. And not to mention the ethical challenge for practitioners of how to maintain trust, privacy, dignity, service user autonomy through the delivery of services via remote relationships, etc. Sorry, Neil, I need you to move me on a bit. Thank you. And so almost inevitably, there's this question of why is there a need for macro engagement in social work? And I think, as Walter had identified earlier in his opening address, there's also socioeconomic policies as a result of neoliberalism, including the gig economies, economic liberalization, all of which have reduced social protection, structural inequality, etc. And there's been an increased precarity across all of our societies, but perhaps have been just less noticeable in the run-up to pandemic. The global shocks and the experience of the pandemic has really demonstrated the inbuilt and growing insecurity within our societies. And one of the things that the pandemic has done is really affirmed our interlinked nature, and that many of our problems and solutions require global collaboration and solidarity, as we recognize our interdependency and reliance on each other. But that also that governance, accountability, and social structures need constant engagement by both professionals and people alike. Sorry, great. And really what we should do when we think about these in under a variety of headings is how should social inequality be viewed and addressed. So I'm aware that I'm under pressure now for time. And that people have a right to freedom and dignity and to live without fear and freedom of want. And that should be core to some of our social work practice. And that what we can see is that changes to employment and rising employment precarity, both within inside our profession as well as in our society as a whole. And that these employment and skills changes has increased informal work arrangements, just increasing that precarity constantly within our society, and that there's a greater need for support and recognition to all parts of our society. Sorry, thank you. And really, I suppose in terms of what we see is a trend towards the centralization of power and resources. There have been changes in many parts to the state, tax and civil liberties, human rights, and other parts of our systems changing. There were enormous moves towards privatization pre-COVID in a lot of our health services, but the same health services have really been required, state-led health services, to manage the pandemic itself. And although many of our politicians might clap and profess a newfound understanding of state health systems, when the pandemic memory fades, will those echoes of privatization return, but perhaps under a different narrative? Already we have echoes of the post-COVID austerity requirements, and will that become a new push to privatize core services and the use of technology in order to bring about those savings that politicians are discussing? And we need to think about, as a profession, how state support should be distributed, the need for new negotiated social contract between all groups of people in our societies, as well as accusations of fraud by our elites across many of our societies, and what's social work's role in holding people to account. In terms of co-designing the structure and operation of social work, the pandemic has brought greater awareness of social production within household and labour, and the crisis gives us an opportunity to rethink some of the way that this has traditionally been done. As has been talked about already, death rates in care homes have been worsened by austerity, low public commitment and knowledge, and lack of knowledge by the population as a whole. And I suppose we feel that there needs to be a greater assertiveness by social work, to be much more interdisciplinary, engaging in wider system and policies, to ensure that we support the design, implementation and the evaluation of care services, so that they really support the needs of people rather than just being the recipients or being caught in the structures. And so we need to have much greater engagement in social policy development, implementation and evaluation. For a social work profession, I think we've alluded to this, or other speakers have alluded to this, we need to have a future lens. We need to imagine, in part, what is coming for the future. And we have to have due regard for our professional workforce. And that particularly is a largely female state-employed profession, except in India, where it's largely private NGOs and corporate social responsibility. Social work is increasingly focused on micro-intervention in many countries, and we need to think about the role of regulation in forcing us down that particular role and route. The re-evaluation of professional role and purpose from the perspective of social work, and how do we address the loss of confidence in skills, expertise, and support those in practice. This kind of academic social work that we all engage in the challenges of social work in practice. And consider the debate in the use of technology in social work, including the use of artificial intelligence, whose role I'm sure will be pushed in the future. And one of the things that we need to recognize, I suppose, is the international changing nature of traditional care contexts and our preparedness for some of those shifts and changes. Already we see a looming crisis as a result of Brexit within the UK, not to mention other countries. And again, this widening knowledge base that has been discussed earlier about how do we engage with some of those issues too. In terms of social work education, regulation has increased our focus on micro-intervention and neglected macro and meso, with the exception possibly of Brazil. We need as a profession to be much more confident in challenging power and to dealing with the deficits and skills that have arisen in many of our junior colleagues through their training during the pandemic. And we need to reaffirm our role as social workers as experts in the dynamics of society and families. The reincorporation of global perspectives as we consider our changing societies, etc. And recognize that precarity both exists within the academy as well as outside of and the impact of social distancing on professional socialization and support. How do we strengthen the social aspects of relationships, not only in our profession, but more widely? And I'm almost towards the end now, and thinking about, and this is a theme which has come up through this afternoon, social work and the media, the recognition of health heroes through the pandemic, but that social work has largely been unseen. There's been no voice, no recognition of social work throughout this, and nor often of the powerless. And in part, we also need to prepare for the psychosocial risks of pandemic and crisis, and that can also be economic crisis. And we need to be cautious about transferring research evidence without necessarily considering the context from which it comes. And if all of this is too bigger a challenge for us to consider, I would just point us back to an African proverb, which is, if you think you're too small to make a difference, then you've never spent a night with a mosquito in a closed room. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil and Gary, and thank you so much for packing what was obviously clearly a very extensive project into a very small number of minutes. So I really appreciate that, and it's really fascinating to hear of, you know, from a UK perspective, Brazil and India are often presented in a particular light that is not as successful as us in how we responded to the pandemic. So it's really interesting to hear those stories and how you've woven together in those shared concerns. So thank you for that. Okay, we are over, but I'm hoping that it will be okay for folks to stay on a little while longer so that we can have a Q&A and then hear from Stephen, who will round things off. So I'm just going to call back the folks who contributed to this panel, whichever clever wizard is behind the scene, clicking the right buttons that's bringing folks into view. Thank you so much for that. I think we're just waiting on Natalia, Colin, so we have Samuel. That's fantastic. So thanks so much. It was really wonderful and actually thinking about the resonances with this morning's session, which I know you guys, apart from Natalia, went at. It was so early in the morning for most of us. I guess around, there's these big questions and big challenges that we face on the one hand, and social work's role within that. And I kind of had a feeling from our earlier panel, there's a sort of oscillation between the end of social work and what's social work capable of, or what's social work job, and are these intractable problems, and what do these look like in real time. And you guys have really given us sort of insights into how some of these bigger questions, what they look like on the ground, and therefore what actually might happen. I suppose the other thing that I was aware of is that I was conscious within the presentations, you know, maybe of two halves, and that Samuel and Natalia, your presentations were really quite, we used Tom, the word Tom has made problematic for us, critical of social work and the social work role and social work complicity with systems that are oppressive on the one hand, and that with Colin, Gary and Neil's presentation, there was something a bit more optimistic about here's a way we can, here's things we can do that can actually work with social work's established value base. So I suppose my question for you all is just thinking about that, and how do you feel when you think from the now, when you're thinking about what is possible? Does that seem like something that does it seem like the right questions are being asked that will make changes in the future, or are you feeling we have a mountain to climb and I'm not quite sure if it is social work or if it's something else? So just interested in your responses to that.
If I could say something, I think one of the problems we've got, and this has been well researched by Jane Fenton from Dundee University, is that we have a generation of social workers now who have never known any different other than neoliberal managerialism, and whose expectations of the role are really very, very narrow. And so the problem therefore is that they're not challenging from within the profession, or not challenging enough. There's not enough of them challenging. And so managers who have that narrow focus are getting away with things that they shouldn't be. And we have a regulation system in the UK, at least, which isn't based on the stuff that Walter was talking about earlier, the values of the International Federation of Social Work. It's based on disciplining the workforce and ensuring that it does what managers and government want it to do. So that works against people organising to challenge. I think that's a massive problem, and that's where those of us whose roots are outside in the practicalities of day-to-day work really need alliances with those of you that are doing some of that challenging from within the teaching institutions.
I suppose just to echo some of Colin's thoughts there, just from my perspective in regards to like immigration control, I think there's been a good pushback in regards to the NHS and Department of Education, especially the NHS. They've got Doctors Against Borders, and they've been able to like start a campaign up to say that, you know, I think it's patients, not passports. So they've kind of said, you know, we're gonna do our job, and we're not going to check someone's immigration status. We're not going to ask for passports, that kind of thing. But I do think that social work's in a bit of a different situation in terms of legislation and policy that like requires them to check immigration status. But it would be nice to see statutory social workers push back against that. But I think more research needs to be done with statutory social workers to see what the kind of mood is within that space, because it must be extremely difficult for them to speak out on these issues. But I think there's Social Work Without Borders that are doing a fantastic job in this area, but they are, you know, a separate charity that's out with statutory social work. But there is spaces there within the third sector where there is a lot of pushback. It's just not within the state sector really.
Sorry, I'm just picking up Rosemary's comment on iPhone here, where she's effectively saying that, and just social work practice evolves and moves away from community integration social work practice to statutory safeguarding. More values need to be given to social workers who work outside the statutory sector. And I guess, I suppose that is the question around, can social work do this if it is so constrained? And, you know, from Samuel's historical work, constrained by social cultural values, but also by systems. You know, is it the systems that need to change? And if they do change, then do you have to work outside them, I guess?
Maybe just link to what Rosemary wrote and what the colleagues said before. I think one important concept of social work is actually that social work wants to understand and question social work practices. And if looking at social work education, I think it's really a big challenge, as Colin mentioned, that nowadays in social work education, from my point of view, it's a lack that students don't learn to question practice. It's more that they want to learn methods of practice. And for me, this is an important part of social work and it's strongly linked that we want to understand impact on biographies, because in social work history, this was also a very strong and important role that we want to understand those who are affected by the social work practice. So just in short, I think it was mentioned also, and also from our research, maybe it's about a circular logic between meso, macro, and micro. There was also a quote before in the chat. We can't think it separately, so we really have to think about the circular logic between those very important roles. And I think the micro and the macro is not much more in social work education anymore. It's a strong focus on meso logic.
I totally agree with all the points that have been raised. I think that as an educator, I am optimistic, and I do think that this, where we're pushing that critical approach to social work, the students that get it really well, but there's still a group that don't get it, and I think that's where we've got to do a bit of work. And I like Colin's point in that, you know, perhaps we can push for this sort of appreciation of macro, but it's what happens when the students get out into the workforce and hit that sort of managerialism as well. I think that's something that we've got to work to change, but perhaps social work education's got a role in that as well. Perhaps we need to be better at integrating ourselves with social work practice and continuing to to promote CPD in that respect.
And have you been able to, I'm interested from Gary, and as I'm not sure is the point of view and from your team's point of view around, have you been able to incorporate these voices from Brazil and India into education, and how does that influence students?
So I couldn't quite hear you there.
Sorry, I'm just thinking about, you know, your project is offering this amazing opportunity to really understand how it's not this issue that traverses the globe plays out in these different social political contexts. And I just wonder if you've been able to use that, employ that within education and within your practitioner colleagues to help sort of shift views or inform views.
I mean, I think there are wider discussions, and I think it's partly are about, I think as Colin raised, I think about having these discussions and bringing the echoes, because one of the real challenges is that neoliberalism has created a framework and a context, almost an ecosystem, if you like, in which social work gets practiced, but we never really get to imagine what it would be like outside of that ecosystem, and how we would get out. So for many practitioners and academics are constantly thinking about how do we solve these problems, but always within the ecosystem of neoliberalism. And what we have to kind of try imagine is something different. And I think one of the things that sometimes international perspectives offers us is an opportunity to reflect on our own context as well, from a different space, which sometimes is perhaps a little bit easier and to be open to challenge, but also to see that some of the battles are similar yet different in some kind of ways. And so certainly I think trying to bring those voices in as a profession at a global level are really quite critical.
I'm conscious of, I'm thinking of a friend and colleague who works in India with young people who have a disability diagnosis, and trying to think through with her some of the challenges, because the political and economic context is so incomparable to what would be possible here. It's not that I can come with any answers or anything, but it's really, it forces you into thinking differently when you're confronted with that, just as you say, and perhaps there is an opportunity there to open up for it. I'm going to pick up some questions here that are in the chat. Nicolette, you've written yours down. I don't know if you want to speak to it, to something talking. If you can't talk, okay. Found interesting is the links between the Sally's presentation and errors, not only the education system is Kafkaesque, but also the search for origin for adopted persons, and reading more for parents of origin who search for the child. Authorities and therefore social work set very high hurdles and send the searching people often to one office to the next, and often researching their own Facebook, don't have a lot of information. Social workers have very much power as they have in the immigration context. So I suppose, and I guess again that I could see how those two situations would link completely, and you know, what is the role there of social work? Do you turn to the voluntary sector, as Rosemary has suggested, or do you change the system from within, and is it changeable? Okay, I'm so conscious that we've gone over time, and I have asked Stephen to give us some feedback on the afternoon as a whole, and some comments. So Stephen, I'm going to hand the stage over to you, and hopefully those who are with us can stay for another 10, 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Heather. Heather, I think you've done a great sort of summary of different ideas and perspectives as we've moved on, and I thought what might be really helpful to presenters and participants is perhaps if you could bring Walter and I, Walter as keynote speaker and give him a final opportunity, if you could bring Walter and I back into conversation so that we can pick up on some of the themes, I think it would do an injustice, and it'd be pretty much impossible to try and summarize all the papers within a 10-minute slot. So perhaps if we could try that sort of experimentally. I don't know whether Walter's still around. And perhaps, Walter, if I can just run past with you a few of the kind of common or dominant themes that have presented themselves to me, you could respond through the lens of your earlier keynote paper.
Hopefully that's possible. Walter, are you here?
I don't think he's around.
Okay,
I can't
all right.
find him in the participants list.
Well, that experiment was not a failure, so forget it. Okay. As I say, Heather, I think you've done a great summary of the thing. There are several things that kind of came to me as we were going through the different papers. One, I think, was the power of. One was about the power of interdisciplinarity, and I think that what we've seen today might well be described as, if you like, interdisciplinarity in motion. And that, for me, not only suggests the kind of fertile ground that social work can trawl in relation to other disciplines like anthropology, political theory, sociology, geography, and so on and so forth, but it made me think about whether social work is well positioned, whether it has a certain amount of mobility with it that allows it to move into other disciplinary areas in a way that some of the other disciplines can't. And going back to some of the thoughts by Alice and Yusun, this idea that we need to kind of dismantle some of the dogged and dry perspectives that we've inherited, and things were mentioned like Piaget and so on and so forth. But it's really clear that, if you like, looking at the richness and the depth of contemporary social sciences, that some of the material that we're drawing on is really vastly outdated. And I think that interdisciplinarity for social work puts us in a positive hue for thinking about how we might think differently about the social work education curriculum and so on and so forth. So that was a kind of dominant theme that cropped up for me early on and throughout. The second question, or the second issue, was this question about what is the political, and how do we understand the political, and various speakers have approached that in different ways. And just going back to I've just got like tons of notes here, but going back to some of the comments that were made by Tom when he was really offering a kind of critique of critique. I just wondered, and please bring Tom back in if he wants to join in here. I just wondered what kind of politics he might imagine in terms of the way that critical thinking or critical social work might start to craft, address, and unpack some of these challenging issues that we've talked about today. So this question about what is the political, and I guess by implication, where does resistance sit in relation to that? And I know that Don has made several comments during the past few hours about this question of hope versus apathy and things like that. So I think the second theme for me that was important throughout this was this question about what is the political, which leads to my third question, and I think Colin went for this head on, and so did Gary in his last comments, and that's about what is the relationship between critical social work and mainstream social work, and that is I think a very vexed and difficult question, because when Colin describes mainstream social work as dull and ineffective and so on and so forth, I think that resonates very much with what we hear from our colleagues in practice. But it also raises this really difficult and sometimes awkward question about what roles do people play, what various roles do people play in terms of challenging that, and what is a kind of active political role, and what does activism look like across the different dimensions of social work. So this relationship between critical social work and mainstream social work, I think, has not been fully addressed, and it's not been challenged head on, and that requires that we carefully define what we mean by mainstream social work, and is it really as bad as we think it is, or is it really as bad as what we're told? So is there a kind of empirical project there to look at some of this kind of this crafting and this kind of boundary making around mainstream social work? The third theme that I thought was really kind of interesting and stood out was, it seems as though there's almost a kind of consensus within the audience and within the presenters that community social work is the way forward, and that the kinds of revisions and the kinds of unpickings and disentanglements that are needed, both within practice, within policy making, but also within research and theory building, that one of the key tasks, and I know Walter has made a comment in response to Colin's paper about the creation of alliances and allegiances at an international level, and that sounds strategically like a very worthwhile approach to me. But do we have that kind of consensus? And if there is a consensus around community social work is the way forward, we need to think carefully about what we mean by community, because community as a concept is highly contested, particularly in light of current philosophical debates. And also we need to think about some of the kind of pressing issues around ecology and environment that have often been overlooked previously by certain community social work type stances. So if community social work is the way forward, how do we widen our sense and application of community social work so that it incorporates some of the issues that are very, very pressing and predominant today, the Black Lives Matter issues around ethnicity and so on and so forth. So that was my fourth theme, if you like, that kind of gravitated towards me. And the final bit, I guess, is the inevitable theme around the post-COVID and what does the new normal mean, and the kind of concept that sort of came into my head, I was thinking about that, was this notion of the revenge of the real, and some of my colleagues are talking about this new religion of health and how public health is starting to dominate a new agenda for science. And where does that leave social work? Does it leave social work hanging on the coattails of a kind of hardening scientism that's driven by a particular epistemology, epidemiology of how we think about what I call the biopolitics of people's lives? It's a shame we can't bring Walter in, but I'm happy for any of the, Heather, I'm happy for any of the other presenters to come in if they want to come back and discuss any of those things. Thank you.
Absolutely. Just to take some comments from the floor or thoughts.
The other thing I wanted to say, Heather, is I'm thinking here about Natalia's emerging interest around biotechnologies and around bordering technologies. This question about, and it gets back to the mainstream versus the critical social work theme, this question about whether we can say fairly with some certainty that social work as it currently stands is a dangerous method. and it does. My cat's just, she's my research assistant. She's just wandered in. So this question about whether we think that mainstream social work is a dangerous method, and if we do think that, that harkens to some debates that are currently happening with my colleagues in the US, particularly out of Texas, and with some of their Black Lives Matter colleagues about the idea of abolishing different aspects of social work, and they focus particularly on child protection and think quite categorically that child protection from top to bottom is a dangerous method.
And that is the sort of the defund social work agenda that I think, was it Alicia that mentioned that? Was that am I confusing things? I'm not sure. Alicia and Lucia spoke of this defund social work agenda. I guess it's really fascinating, Stephen. There's definitely I sort of can align with those views from what was discussed also this morning.
And just to say to presenters and things, we've talked here at Glasgow about ways forward with this in terms of dissemination, and I'm sure Heather's going to mention something about this later, but I mean, it's really clear here that there's some fabulous and fantastic opportunities to bring this together in some kind of written or interpretive form.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Stephen. I should say to folks in Leal, right, people to say.
So I've got about 40 pages of notes here for you, Heather, to pick up afterwards. So I'll pass them on to you later. Okay, thanks everyone. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you so much for coming together. Yeah, as Stephen mentioned, for those of you who here, we are planning to publish a volume collection, either through a special edition of a journal, or through one of the fine publishing houses. So if that's something you're interested in, we would definitely be sort of talking to you about how that can move forward. There's so many shared themes. It was a challenge. You know, we threw out a wide call and got lots of really exciting responses, and trying to sort of piece together and look for synergies and resonances, and working with time zones is a challenge. So it's exciting to see how work is working in very different locations with very different on the face of the issues, and resonates and does build towards a sort of picture and questions that need to be asked. So yes, so that's something we should be in touch with you about. We're over time, and as ever, 20:05. We have another block left, the Americas block, which will be starting at 8 o'clock my time, which is Scotland time. I don't know what time that is for you, but we hope